For those who are just joining this live streaming, my name's Tim Hunt from RaboResearch. We're here on Cockatoo Island for Rabobank's Farm2Fork event. We have 1,500 clients and industry participants coming here today. A lot of excitement in the air as we look to celebrate agriculture and address some of the issues that will shape this industry over the next 10 to 20 years. As I say, technology is a big part of what we're discussing here today. But some types of technology can take a while to catch on. In particular, there's no point in us developing technologies unless the consumer or downstream market will accept them. And we've seen examples throughout a long stretch of hundreds of years of history of this. I was struck by an example I heard from The Economist magazine recently, that something as simple as the fork took 400 to 500 years to catch on, as people overcame their reluctance to use this new technology despite its obvious utility. More recently, concepts like Google Glass that have enormous functionality have not caught on, largely because people feel it's too geeky to wear computers in front of your eyes. So it's really incumbent upon us as industries to not only develop and harness technologies, but communicate about those downstream in a manner that they will be accepted by our customers, often the end consumer. And that's the case with a number of things that are now developing. And this is going to end up in a situation where consumers have increasingly complex choices around the types of food they choose. And just two examples are their attitudes to, do I accept GM products or do I not? How do I feel about glyphosate in the food supply chain? As they add food sustainability to their shopping basket, how do they weigh up these sort of things? So we're keen to discuss this morning the increasingly complex choices consumers face. And with me here, I'm very pleased this morning to discuss that, is our senior grains and oilseed analyst, based with us in Orange, New South Wales, Cheryl Kalisch Gordon. Cheryl, welcome to Livestream.
Welcome. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah. It's great to be here.
Have you had a walk through, had a look at a few things already this morning?
I have been into the innovation garden and caught up with a couple of our clients that are doing some really interesting things. Yep. And there's quite a number of them. So I've got to go back shortly. Yeah.
Yep. So Cheryl, let's kick this off with introducing the reason why we think that consumer choices are going to be increasingly complex at the moment and into the future.
Well, I think over time, the key drivers of decisions have been really a trade-off between price and quantity, or price and quality. Yep. But increasingly, we see that it's quality versus quality. And I don't mean like higher quality, I mean different sorts of qualities that reflect different sustainability elements. Yep. Within the production cycle of those particular products that consumers might be choosing. And it's not obvious always that you are making a trade-off, and particularly when we're thinking about issues in silos where consumers might be particularly concerned about single issues. Yep. And they're not aware of what that means for a trade-off for another environmental issue that hasn't come into their thinking space yet.
Yep. And that's a complex environment in which for companies to sell into, because it's entirely plausible, and we actually see this, that consumers buy certain products with one quality in mind, which might be just straight price, and then turn to another product line and have another quality in mind, which might be either the provenance of the product or its sustainability. So they're not necessarily consistent across their purchasing decisions.
Yeah, correct. I believe that the labelling of products as non-GM can be in itself, it's a marketing tool. Yep. And it speaks to concerns of particular consumers, but on its own, and without the context of the broader environmental and agricultural system. Yep. Are consumers making the best choice for a better world is debatable, because it's not informed by the other alternatives and substitutions that are being required to make that decision to choose to consume.
So why is this important to agricultural operators, and particularly those in Australia and New Zealand?
So I think it speaks to how we look to the future and what choices we make into the future. Yep. We have some particularly pertinent examples of decisions that are already being brought into the grain space in particular, which is why I'm concerned about this. And one would be the example of glyphosate. And so there's been an increasing movement globally for consumers to say, well, you know, I don't want glyphosate used in our country or in our production systems. Mm-hmm. And of course, glyphosate has been a really important tool here in Australia for the production of grains, the more sustainable production of grains, the cheaper production of grains. And those that are making the decision about choosing not to want glyphosate in their system are not necessarily aware of that trade-off, but with reduced sustainability and additional tillage that would be required to produce grains otherwise. So for farmers in Australia thinking about, well, what is the future, I think that there needs to be an education that spreads across the sector and into the consumption side of things about holistic production, not just single issue production issues and consumer concerns.
Yep. Cheryl, another really strong case study of this that you've discussed with me before is the situation with vegetable oil consumption in Europe and the trends we see unfolding there. Tell us a little bit about that situation and why it illustrates this complex choice so powerfully.
Yeah, so in Europe, palm oil is a really important part of the biofuel production. And of course, biofuels are used as a combatant of greenhouse gases in itself. Yep. So that's speaking to one environmental issue. So then palm oil has been used in that, speaking to the consumer concern about carbon emissions. But then now, increasingly, we're seeing concern about the sustainability of palm oil. And so, you know, quite rightly, they're concerned about the sustainability of rainforests in Southeast Asia, orangutans. And so EU has recently announced that they're not going to use unsustainable palm oil from Southeast Asia in biofuels. And so that speaks to the phasing out of it generally. For consumers, that's a tick. But then what's the alternative? So by doing that, and that's not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but what is the alternative? Well, the EU is known for having an anti-GM stance. So one of the alternatives in that oil space would be GM soy.
Or, putting our hands up here, canola from Australia.
Correct. So it could be canola from Australia, which would be good for Australian farmers. But Australian canola production requires glyphosate. And the EU has recently been through the process of renewing glyphosate licensing. Yep. And it only renewed for 5 years. And that wasn't related to the science of it, it was related to consumer and social concern about the use of glyphosate. So it snookers consumers in terms of you haven't thought of what are the trade-offs down the track. And I think, you know, you can think about this in terms of, well, I need to make human health trade-offs, but even in the environmental space, are they making those decisions? And can they? Because they're so far removed from the decision. It's not about personal utility, it's about utility associated with the broader environment and the world.
Yep. So that's a very complex sort of decision tree or set of dominoes, as you've outlined. We have an EU consumer or industry first looking to produce biofuels because that's seen as more sustainable. The first choice is palm oil, which then turns out to have sustainability issues for a significant share of production. So we look then for alternatives. We see soy, which is largely genetically modified, which some in the EU are not comfortable with, or products like canola out of Australia, which is produced using glyphosate in the production process. What are the main implications for the Australian grains and oilseed industry of these consumers having a really complex choice like that?
So I think what it means, and particularly in grains where we do have bulk production, bulk supply chains, you need to be aware of the industry responses because it is a shared responsibility in this. And that speaks then also to how government policy is really formed, the value of science being the basis of this conversation. And increasingly we do see that decisions aren't being made necessarily on science. So we have the EU decision that I mentioned. The science didn't support that. The science supported the renewal of the licensing for another 15 years, as is the case with chemicals typically in the EU. But instead, they licensed it for another 5 years. Yep. So I think that in itself speaks to a more rapidly changing landscape for decisions.
Yep.
And then going back to my point, it's about industry and government thinking about this for bulk. But if you're not in the bulk game, then there are certainly opportunities. As Australia as a whole could have the opportunities at the bulk level as well, but as individuals, increasingly with larger farms having greater off-take in their own right and greater control of their supply chains, there are certainly opportunities. But in the context of this, we all need to be considering how we engage with the broader community and to consumers about a holistic approach to this. Yep. A better world is not necessarily created by speaking to one silo issue because you haven't thought about the trade-offs throughout the supply chain and the world. Yeah.
Yep. And this gets really interesting, Cheryl, because we're talking about trying to explain and deliver to consumers qualities that are not self-evident at the point of purchase or consumption. So we're talking about consumers being interested in sustainable product, possibly non-GMO, possibly and/or glyphosate in the supply chain, along with other things we see consumers looking for these days, provenance, perhaps it's organic, perhaps it's local. These are all attributes that are not self-evident when you see the product on the shelf or when you consume it, in the way that quality used to be, eating quality, for example. So this means that trust plays a huge role in this equation, doesn't it? As we look to convince the consumer, this is the way your food is produced and you can be comfortable with it. How do we help establish that trust?
Well, I think that point about trust is increasingly important. We really have seen an erosion of trust in communities generally, whether it's associated with government bodies and the like. Everyone has, in a sense, become their own authority because you can Google, you can do your own research, and suddenly everyone's a little expert in their own echo chamber, which you've spoken about recently in a podcast. And so that trust, increasingly important. Anything that farmers can do to enhance trust and assure consumers that what is on the label or what they have purchased speaks to their values is increasingly important. And I think, technologies like blockchain will be, or a version of blockchain will be important in that. I think that we are fortunate in Australia that many of, globally, Australia does have a trust element associated with it in itself. And farmers inherently are trusted. Nurturing that whilst also maintaining a professionalism about it is the challenge, I think. But the trust is a critical element for people to make that purchasing decision, as you say, on something that they can't tell the difference, particularly once it's in a loaf of bread. There's it's 5 steps from being in the grain itself. And you highlight a really important point there, Cheryl, that there are 2 fronts we can address this. One, in building trust in our agricultural systems, supply chains, food processing industries. The other one is through harnessing some of the technologies that are on display and being promoted today that will essentially prove to the consumers where the product is coming from, what treatments were used, and as long as they trust the technology, that's another way that we can establish trust that they're getting what they wanted and increase the chances we'll be able to extract fair value for better supply chain and better supply systems. But
But just going back to that as we close off here, that final point, these are very complex choices we're helping consumers navigate. Do you expect we'll be able to do this better in the next 5 to 10 years? Because it's proven to be very difficult in the last 5 to 10 to tell that complex story to consumers and get them to make what many of us would say a sensible, balanced decisions.
Look, I think as we look further into technologies, there will be opportunities that will make it easier, but then that also adds to the other silos that people might belong to in their decisions, the tribes, if you will, that are concerned about particular issues. So I don't think it necessarily gets easier. Whether we can harness the tools to take up the challenge is where it really lies for me. Let's take it on. Let's be front-facing on it and meet the consumer needs in a way that we know is going to be holistically sustainable rather than silo sustainable.
Okay. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us this morning on live stream to discuss what is an incredibly important issue for not just grains and oilseed, but our agricultural systems as a whole. We're here to discuss issues that will shape the future of this industry. I'm confident we'll get better at that as we harness these technologies, step out of our own echo chambers, and really increasingly build that trust and help consumers navigate complex choices. So
thanks for having me.
Enjoy your time this morning, and I look forward to seeing you out as we gather at the main stage later today.
Good one. Thank you.